Good evening. I'm Simla DOİNGÜN from University, the Department of English Language and Literature. Welcome to the fifth of our World Literature webinar series. Today I have the pleasure and the privilege of hosting Professor Dr. Mehmet ÇELİKEL, who is going to give us a talk titled as From Postcolonial Multiculturalism to Neocolonial Multicultural Uniformity. Welcome and thank you for being here with us on this webinar.
Thank you. Thank you.
Before we begin with our discussion, I'd like to remind our audience that any remarks and questions will be most welcome. You may want to post them on the chat box during the webinar. We will try our best to respond to each one of them in the time allotted for this event. And I'd like to talk about Professor Dr. ÇELİKEL's academic background briefly. Professor Dr. ÇELİKEL graduated from the Department of English Linguistics at Hacettepe University in Ankara in 1993. He completed his MA in English Language and Literature at the University of Hertfordshire in England in 1997. He got his PhD with a thesis entitled The Postcolonial Condition, the Fiction of Rushdie, Qureshi, and Roy at Liverpool University in England in 2001. He has published 2 academic books in Turkish, Sömürgecilik Sonrası İngiliz romanında Kültür ve Kimlik, Culture and Identity in Postcolonial English Novel in 2011, and Çağdaş İngiliz yazınında Küreselleşme, Göç ve Kültür, Globalization, Migration, and Culture in Contemporary British Fiction. He currently works as professor at the Department of English Language and Literature, Pamukkale University in Denizli, Turkey. Professor ÇELİKEL, welcome again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be giving this talk for the English Language and Literature Department at Doğuş University. And I would like to thank you, Dr. DOİNGÜN, for inviting me to give a talk. I'm really pleased and honored to be here. And when you invited me to this talk, I was wondering what I could talk about, and you gave me the idea of talking about postcolonial theory. Mm-hmm. And I thought I could pretend to know something about postcolonial theory this evening. And this is something I've been thinking about for the past maybe 10 years, because I started to think about multiculturalism in postcolonial condition. And I thought that multiculturalism is evolving into a sort of uniform identity globally all around the world. But let me begin with talking about the postcolonial theory and what it is about. It's not only about the ways we read and analyze fiction written by the writers coming from the formerly colonized lands, but also how we understand our present reality that shape our identity, even in the contemporary age, because colonization is an ongoing process. Because we are still under the influence of the cultural condition constructed by the postcolonial era, the global cultural condition constructed by the postcolonial era. I'd like to begin like Terry Eagleton begins his literary theory. He says that if there is something called literary theory, there's definitely a literature which it is the theory of. So I also want to say that if we talk about postcolonial literary theory, there must be something called postcolonial literature, of which it is the theory. So postcolonial fiction that the postcolonial theory is about covers the writing in English from various colonized lands, and it has affected our understanding of the contemporary world that shape our identity through various forms of cultural media. But how? This dates back to the Orientalist approaches of the Western perspective. because all over the world we are influenced by this Orientalist, quote unquote, Orientalist approach towards the people in the further East. And it shapes our identity and it shapes our approach in the cultural media all over the world, by the films that we watch, by the songs that we listen to, by the books that we read, and by the advertisements that we see around and the billboards that we see around. We are given a collective unconscious mind to look around us and to understand ourselves. And where do we put ourselves in the world culturally? And where do we identify our being and our cultural ontology in the universe? This contemporary world, which was drawn by the postcolonial writers, tend to portray delusionary frameworks of what might be called a multicultural condition. I want to call it a condition because as you mentioned in the introduction, I used postcolonial condition as the title of my thesis, and in the title of my thesis, I used postcolonial with a hyphen, post-colonial, to refer to the historical period which is after the colonization. So I didn't want to use postcolonial theory as a sort of political stance against the colonial rule. But I will come to that point, how I changed my mind in 20 years. However, multiculturalism that is used to describe the cultural condition in the aftermath of colonization has turned into a norm and emerged as a uniform identity in civic life all over the world, particularly in the metropolises, in the major metropolises of the world. Hence, the multicultural condition has been overwhelmingly observed in uniform style in parts of the world, with or without a colonial past. And Turkey is one of the examples that I give to my students in my postcolonial lectures. And I say that this is the reason we speak English in this class, because we have never been officially colonized, and we have never been a colonial country, but however, we bear the consequences of a typical postcolonial country. We have English shop names, we have restaurant menus written in English, we have schools in which the education is fully in English. So in this talk, I would like to put an emphasis on multicultural condition in the aftermath of colonial rules and question whether or not it is still relevant to talk about multiculturalism in the postcolonial sense. But to go back in history, I would like to talk about the 15th century. In the 15th century, or in other terms, by the 15th century, Europe geographically was stuck in between two cultures. So the Arabic rule from the southwest of Europe, as far as the southern borders of France in northern Spain, and the Turkish forces as far as Hungary and Austria, even Vienna. So European powers were stuck in between those two contrasting cultures and military powers. So they started a reconquest, which was called the Spanish Reconquest. So the Arabic rule ended by the Spanish Reconquest in the 15th century. So the whole Hispanic peninsula became Latin again. So the Arabs were sent back to Africa. And in the same century, Southern America was Latinized because the Portuguese sailors started to sail west, and they explored the southern parts of American continent, and they Latinized the whole continent, which marked the end of the Inca and Aztec civilization. And in the same century, the conquest or fall, the conquest of Istanbul or fall of Constantinople took place. So was it ever the conquest or the fall is still open to debate, of course. So the clash of civilizations is not something new. Clash of civilizations did not come into being in the 20th century. And multicultural condition is not something new. It didn't come into being in the 20th century. And the churches in Istanbul were being turned into mosques, while the mosques in Spain were being turned into churches again. So that was the beginning of European colonization, which would be the core point of my argument tonight. It is possible to talk about a multicultural condition in both the colonies and in the imperial center, because in the beginning years of my academic studies in postcolonial theory, I always argued powerfully that postcolonial condition was also the multicultural condition. But then when I read the novels written in the 19th century or the novels written in the 18th century, we see the traces of multiculturalism too. And in the imperial center, there were always people from the colonized lands. The Orientalism, Western perception, is the portrayal of the colonized as inferior. And this Orientalist perspective affected the Western mind, affected the colonizer's mind, to have a view of the colonized people as inferior, as other, and as people with weird habits, with incomprehensible language. So, in the 20th century, Frantz Fanon wrote The Wretched of the Earth. But who are they? Who were the wretched of the earth that he was talking about? The wretched of the earth actually represented the disadvantaged ones, but in general terms, the wretched of the earth were clearly non-Europeans. And what are the differences between imperialism and colonialism? Very basically, in the most cliché terms, imperialism can survive without the colonial rule, without the colonial practice, whereas the colonial practice cannot survive without the theoretical support and ideological support of imperialism. The ideological background of imperialism is necessary for the survival of the colonial rule, colonial practice. The first imperialist settlers were famously nuns, as well as the sailors and traders. There were also nuns because a church meant three things: a health center, Jesus Christ, and the English language, because nuns were at the same time very good nurses, and they vaccinated the children that had never been vaccinated before, or they provided the people with medicines. And when they went to the church, they made an association in their minds with health and Christianity. So that was the early stages of cultural imperialism. And then exploration came, because the adventure writing, Rider Haggard's She or King Solomon's Mines, can be counted as the examples of adventure writing. Adventure writing inspired people in the path to exploration of the unknown lands and the faraway countries. exploration is followed by possession. As it happens in Robinson Crusoe, Robinson explores the desert island and then he possesses it. He says that this is my island. And he begins to redefine it. He gives a name to the black man that he finds. He never asks his name, but he names him. So exploration, possession, and redefinition. And depiction of the colonized as inferior, savage, weird, incomprehensible. Colonial fiction is full of detailed landscape descriptions, and colonized people are portrayed as other, strange, and marginal. But of course, there was an end to the colonial rule in the 20th century. Because a few centuries old colonial rule created hybridity. Hybridity is not only the aspect of the postcolonial era, but it also occurred during the colonial rule, because cultural hybridity was always possible, even in the colonized lands. People who spoke two languages, as in Rudyard Kipling's Kim. And ambivalence, for example, again, Kim keeps asking himself, who am I? Am I a Hindu? Am I a Jew? Or am I a Muslim? And mimicry, famously mimicking the imperial powers. And Baba's term, unhomeliness, in the postcolonial era, nowhere feels like home for the postcolonial immigrants. And heteroglossia, which is very important to support my argument here, because multiculturalism is not only about postcolonial condition, but rather it is about how we are defined within the larger structures of language and culture. And what is multiculturalism then, which was argued mostly in the postcolonial era? Multiculturalism is a tamed version of the highest stage of capitalism in the Leninist sense. But why? Why should we call it as the highest stage of capitalism? Let's remember the Benetton advertisements in 1980s. In the Benetton billboards and the big advertisements of that trademark, the kids from all over the globe wore Benetton t-shirts. This indicates something important. As long as you can afford to buy Benetton, the differences do not matter. So then you have the same rights, or do you really have the same rights, or do you really have the equality? How about the immigrants, for example, who share the benefits of the locals, or who share the space of the locals? Are they considered as threats? My view on multiculturalism is that it is designed as a so-called strategy of taming the disadvantaged, marginal minorities in the periphery, because multicultural policies that came into being, I mean the policies, I don't mean the multicultural condition, but the policies came into being after 1960s to take the people in the periphery to the center, so that they should appear in the center. They should be integrated into the upper culture and upper identity. Such a strategy creates a discourse and poetics that underline multiculturalist policies as the means of integrating the outsiders into the dominant, settled society. Yet, this integration doesn't function to enable the minorities to pronounce their identity Instead, they have to be a part of the upper identity of the hegemony and live their cultural identity as a lower identity. But what does that mean? That means an elimination of the lower identities to elevate them to the level of consumerism. Identities do not matter as long as they sit under the umbrella of Coca-Cola. So multiculturalism, sometimes, I'm sorry to intrude with an anecdote, sometimes I see the students on campus, and in all the universities of the world that I visit, I see the same type of university students. That's how I came to this idea of multicultural uniformity, because in my campus at my university, I can see students from different parts of the world, Africa or Southern Asia, and Turkish students from different parts of the country, and European students sitting under the shade of a large Coca-Cola umbrella at a cafe on campus. So this is why I'm saying that as long as you sit under the umbrella of Coca-Cola, identities do not matter. But I do not think that this gives a comfortable idea of, it doesn't give me a comfortable idea of multiculturalism, because multiculturalism turns into a capitalist phenomenon. It is no more part of the postcolonial condition. It is now a condition that we can observe in the civic culture of the major metropolises of the world. A shopping mall in London is not different from a shopping mall in Istanbul. And I said in the beginning of my talk, colonial rule, colonization is an ongoing process, because as soon as the postcolonial era started, neocolonialism also started. Because it is not possible in the second half of the 20th century and in the 20th century, it is no more practiced. Colonialism is no more practiced in the way it was practiced in the 19th century or in the 18th century. You do not send government officers to the overseas lands to colonize them. But of course, the trademarks go there, McDonald's go there. So this brings about the death of authenticity. Authenticity is dying out. A McDonald's hamburger sold in a local shopping mall in central Anatolia is no more authentic, because at least you cannot find a bacon burger there. Or, in addition, a lahmacun sold in a Western style shopping mall is no more authentic either, because you do not eat it at a small town pide shop. This means it doesn't matter what, where, and when you sell. It is justifiable as long as there's a market for it. Thus, multiculturalism is a comfort zone that validates itself as an elucidating platform for cultural tolerance. Yet this cultural tolerance is not observed today when it comes to speaking of the current global refugee crisis of the present age, or in the case of Palestinian question, which inconceivably falls outside the postcolonial studies, shamefully. So, what are the examples of multicultural condition in literature? Of course, there are many, but let me go back to the early examples of postcolonial fiction and start with Rushdie's The Satanic Verses. And right in the beginning of Satanic Verses, Jibril Farishta sings a rhyme, and he talks about his Japanese hat, Russian shoes, or Indian clothes, but he says that my heart is Indian for all that. And in one part of the book, there's a group of pilgrims who tried to walk the Indian Ocean to arrive in Mecca. And one of the women, Ayşe, is sick and dying of cancer. And her husband begs her to take the Mercedes wagon because he says that it has an ice box and the ice box is full of cokes. Please take it. So this holy mission, and which is going to make their way easy in a very surrealist way, because they believe that the waters of the ocean will part for them to enable them walk on the bed of the ocean as far as the Arabic Peninsula. But however, her husband suggests that she takes the Mercedes wagon and the icebox full of Coca-Cola. Rushdie calls this the Coca-Colonization of the world. And in Hanif Qureishi's fiction, in The Buddha of Suburbia, in The Black Album, and in Something to Tell You, we observe the characters were wearing, for example, Nike sneakers under their sari, or jeans under salwar kameez. Or in the novels of Bernardine Evaristo, for example, who essentially refuses to be studied as a postcolonial writer, or in the novels of Zadie Smith. What I try to emphasize here is that the multicultural condition, which I consider as a capitalist phenomenon, introduced by the liberal economic policies since the early 1980s, is not only a part of postcolonial literature. Haruki Murakami's 1Q84 has countless references to brand names of multinational corporations' products. No one in 1Q84, no one wears an ordinary product. All the products, all the clothes they wear has a name, has a brand name. A guy doesn't simply wear a t-shirt, he wears a Lacoste. Or Edith Shafak, for example, in her fiction, I'm not saying that she uses the brand names, but she uses a multicultural background of Istanbul. She writes her novels in English first, and her novels bear the instances of multiculturalism. Her characters from Turkish, Armenian, and Kurdish backgrounds foreground a multicultural environment. And to go back to the late Ottoman and early Republican Turkish novel, it is also possible to mark Peyami Safa's crime novels that he wrote under the nom de plume Server Bediye. In these novels, he recounts the criminal adventures of a crook thief called Cingöz Recai the Shrewd. And his stories are mostly set in the multicultural parts of Istanbul, where the Greek, Armenian, and Jewish communities live together with the Turkish population. So, to come to the conclusion, I'd like to point out that these scenes of multicultural condition, in particularly the major metropolises of the world, has been evolved into a uniform identity, and the high streets and the shopping malls of the big cities of the world are very similar to one another. And if you enter into in Baudrillard's terms, the simulacra of the big shopping malls, it doesn't matter in which country you live, or it doesn't matter in which climate you live. Once you walk through the sliding doors of a shopping malls, you go into a different level of being, leaving the local culture behind you, and leaving the time period behind you. And here we can talk about Lyotard, for example, because he points out the sudden shifts between time periods and sudden shifts between cultures. Those sudden shifts stop there in a big shopping mall. And this big shopping mall culture can be transferred into the central parts of the major cities of the world, and you see people walking from all around the globe in different colors and different identities and expressing themselves. I'm always anxious about being misunderstood in my criticism against multiculturalism. I'm not criticizing the multicultural, diverse societies. I'm criticizing multiculturalism within the shade of, under the shade of capitalist consumption, because under the shade of capitalist consumption, multicultural identities seem to be more liberated to express themselves, whereas in the other parts of the world, multicultural identities do not find the same chance to express themselves and to express their identities unless they can afford to consume. Okay, so this is my conclusion because it's been, I think, 30 minutes. So if there are any questions or discussions, I will be happy to talk. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor ÇELİKEL, for this insightful talk on the postcolonial condition, capitalism, and multiculturalism, and how they overlap, right? Given the current, let's say, political climate, and also the what's been happening around us, as you've said. And thank you very much for also giving us example works and how this situation comes to be reflected in literature, particularly in, let's say, Murakami's and Rushdie's and Safa's, as well as Shafak's novels. I've seen that there are no questions at the moment, and I was just wondering, perhaps I might ask a question myself. What would you think about the, I mean, of course, we've already mentioned certain places, spaces that have already become multicultural in these novels, for example. But what about the identities, the characters in the novels? They also seem to be represented by some authors quite similar to one another. It is as if that they have also lost their authenticity.
Mm-hmm. Well, nothing seems to be authentic anymore in the globalized world, unless you live in isolation. But in the postcolonial novels that I have studied so far, in most of them, in all of them, the postcolonial immigrants always have to change their identity. At least when they migrate, they have to learn a new language. But this effect is mutual, of course. They have also changed the culture of the country that they have migrated to, their new dwelling place. But the identity problem always occur for those people. For instance, in Monica Ali's, I'm sorry.
Brick Lane?
Brick Lane, yes. All right, Brick Lane.
Okay.
Monica Ali's Brick Lane. All right, the Bangladeshi girl who was forced to marry the Bangladeshi man living in London, and she is forced to migrate to London, and she lives in isolation. But in her life, she begins to change gradually because she becomes aware of the culture that surrounds her. And she becomes aware of the boundaries that her culture puts around her. And maybe this may not have been possible if she stayed at home. But when she moved to London, when she migrated to London, she started to change, and she started to learn a new language, and she started to learn a new culture, although she was very afraid of going out and getting lost outside. But suddenly, she frees herself and starts a new life. Of course, she was no more an authentic Bangladeshi girl, but she becomes a Londoner. On the other hand, the same example can be taken from Timothy Mo's Sour Sweet. The family in Sour Sweet, the Chinese family in Sour Sweet, actually it's a Cantonese family in Sour Sweet, starts running a takeaway food counter. And in this takeaway food counter, they cook a milder Chinese food because they changed the taste for the taste of the British, because they cannot eat very chilly and very hot. But this is not always what they eat at home. But when they go home, they begin to realize that their taste has also changed. They cannot eat their authentic foods at all, because their authentic food tastes too hot and too chilly for them, because they have got used to eating the food they produce in their shop for the British customers. So I lived in England for nearly 6 years, and what happened to me was, in my first breakfast in Britain, they brought me a full English breakfast dish, and there were beans in it. And I was so hungry, and I just had a spoonful of beans. It was cold and sweet, and I hated that. And some 4 years later, while I was watching TV, I was eating spoonfuls of bean from a can. Without heating it, it was sweet, it was cold, but I loved it. So the taste changes, of course. And the first marks of this change in the novels begin with the changes in the food. For instance, in the Satanic Verses by Rushdie, when Jibril Farishta migrates to London, on the first night, he loses his faith because he has a nightmare. And after his nightmare, he wakes up in the morning and he loses all his faith in Islam, and he goes to the restaurant and starts eating all the pork products suddenly. So it was a sudden change, of course, but sudden involvement and integration into the host culture. And there was also a sign, an example of hybridization and changing or moving away from the authentic values, if you like. I don't know if this is an answer to your question, but I've had so many examples coming to my mind.
Very much so, very much so. Thank you very much, really. If we don't have any further, perhaps, remarks and questions, I believe we can end our discussion if you don't have anything else to add.
Mm-hmm.
If there is anything specific, perhaps, that you like to emphasize, especially with regards to multiculturalism or multicultural uniformity, that's what you said. And if not, we can, I think, end our discussion for tonight, and perhaps do a second round in the fall term.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much. I'm glad to have given this talk, and I hope you have enjoyed it, and I hope I haven't bored anyone.
I don't think so, Professor ÇELİKEL, not at all. Thank you very much once again for joining us, for being my guest. And thank you, dear audience, for watching us, for listening to us. If you have any specific questions, you might also like to send them through email. Thank you all, and I wish you a very good evening, good night, and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Good evening. It was a pleasure for me. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.